Okay, now I'm continuing with this sort of whole progress westward data business here. We're adding some more onto the scenario. Progress westward data handles a lot of sensitive personal and business data for its customers. It wants to check that it's following current IT legislation, there we are, it's that again, and cyber security prevention measures are up to date. The IT manager is responsible for cyber security and he's leading a project, there we are again, to review these areas. The IT manager will use a Gantt chart for planning this project rather than a task list. Evaluate this decision. Okay, so when we evaluate a decision, we're comparing the Gantt chart to a task list. So remember, a Gantt chart is where we've got blocks that show the tasks and how they relate to each other. So we might have several tasks going on together and then leading to another task and so on. And a task list is just a series of tasks written down and described. So how might we compare those two things? Now, in order to get marks on this, you need to be comparing the two. It's no good just talking about why a Gantt chart is a great idea. They've mentioned two things, so we need to compare the two together. So we could say something about the fact that the Gantt chart shows how one task is dependent on another. So you can see the effect on a task if another one overruns. This is unlike a task list where you just see what each task is. So you see what we've done there. We've said why a Gantt chart is good, and we've said how that compares to a task list that just shows the list of tasks. So we've compared one thing with another. What else could we say about Gantt charts? Well, in Gantt charts, show the timing and resources used, but a task list just describes the tasks and you can't visually see how long they will take. So again, we've compared the two and said why a Gantt chart is better than a task list. We could say something that's good about a task list. To remember, we're analysing, we're not necessarily agreeing with his decision. So we could say a task list gives a clear view of all the tasks that need to be done, as a Gantt chart may be rather complicated. So again, we've compared them. We've not said that the Gantt chart's the right decision here, but we've said why we think a task list might be a better way of viewing it. Now, if you just described one thing here, like how good a Gantt chart is, and maybe you've written a couple of things about it, you can get 2 marks. If you make one good comparison, so one good comparison like that between a Gantt chart and a task list, then you can have 3 to 4 marks depending on how detailed your description is. If you've made 2 good comparisons between a Gantt chart and a task list, then you can have 5 or 6 marks for that one. Now, PWD uses a variety of logical prevention measures to reduce cybersecurity risks. Now remember, we talk about logical and physical methods of protection. Physical methods of protection are where we actually put a barrier, a physical barrier in the way of someone being able to get to the data or the resources. Logical methods, what's a logical prevention measure? A logical prevention measure is where we use software tools such as passwords, firewalls, antivirus, encryption. So software tools to stop unauthorized access to data. So the important thing here is that a logical prevention measure is a software tool that stops unauthorized access to data. You can have a mark if you sort of state one of these. The important thing here is you need to talk about software and you need to talk about what it's being used for. 1 and 1 makes 2. Okay, on to the last couple of questions on the paper now. At the end of the project, the IT manager produces a word processed report on how well PWD is following current IT legislation. The report contains tables showing the results of the research carried out by the project team. Identify, again, make a statement, and explain one advantage and one disadvantage of using tables to present information in this report. Now notice there are 6 marks for this. So 1 mark for identifying the advantage and then 2 marks for saying something about it, explaining why that's an advantage. Disadvantage, 1 mark for identifying a disadvantage and 2 marks for saying why that might be an issue. So identifying an advantage of tables, so you could talk about it's a clear layout in rows and columns. So there's your advantage. And if it was me, I'd probably put that as a separate statement at the top there, just to make it clear to the examiner that we can mark that as 1 mark. This makes it easy to read across or down to compare different figures. There we go. So again, 1 mark, it's easy to read across or down. What are we doing that for? To compare different figures. So I've talked about the clear layout and I've now explained why that's useful. Now, disadvantage of a table. The disadvantage of the table are, so we could say it's difficult to see immediately, so see straight away, how figures compare. For that, it's better to use a graph, because then you can see, whereas you might have a table with a bunch of figures written on it, then how do I know which one's the biggest? I have to read every single one. But if I do that as a graph, I can see clearly that one's the biggest before we do anything. So it's difficult to see immediately how figures compare. And then you can say the manager has to read each individual figure and remember them to know what the trend is. Trend. What the trend is. So there's a disadvantage to a table. So whereas it's a clear layout, it's very easy to read across and down, it's very difficult to analyse it and pick out the important trends or the changes or which ones are bigger and which ones are smaller in the layout. You could also talk about the fact that it can get very cluttered if there's lots of figures. And you can talk then about how difficult it is. It might be to read because the writing's too small, or there's too much there for one person to take in at a time. Anything like that, okay? So in each case, 1 mark for the identification, 2 marks for the description that follows. And last of all, to finish off, a couple of 1 mark simple statement questions. PwD wants all the employees to act in an ethical and moral way when handling data. This is very similar to the question we did before. The IT manager has been asked to design a poster showing employees how to handle data in an ethical and moral way. Suggest 1 instruction that could be placed on this poster. So again, we could be talking about anything that it says in the Data Protection Act. So, don't share data with unauthorized people, or get consent before using data. Anything that's about what is the right way to use data is an acceptable answer. And again, just a simple phrase is enough to get the 1 mark. Now, identify 1 demographic factor. So we've got another number of demographic factors. In other words, what is it about the people that we're aiming our poster at? So we can think about age, gender, ethnicity. We can talk about the amount of sort of money or the class that people are in. So any of those kinds of things will do as a demographic there. And again, simply stating 1 word there will get you the mark. And then we finished the paper.